The shipyard was my life for 30 years until Miles Watson, a private equity vulture in a cheap suit, took over. He mocked my credentials, called me a worthless burner, and fired me in front of my crew to save pennies. He didn't know I was the only man certified to touch the Navy's hull. So I made one call, sat back and watched his $300 million empire sink faster than a lead anchor. Now before we continue, tell me where you watching from today and what's the temperature? The smell of a shipyard is something you never get out of your pores. It's a mix of ozone, brine, rust, and the metallic tang of grinding steel. To most people, it smells like industry. To me, it smelled like home. I stood on the gantry overlooking Dry Dock 4, watching the sparks cascade down like orange waterfalls. Below me, the massive gray hull of the USS Vindicator sat in the cradle. She was a destroyer, a beast of war, and she was currently undergoing a midlife refit that was valued at $300 million. And I was the one ensuring she didn't crack under the pressure of the deep Atlantic. My name is John Wood. I'm 55 years old, and my knees pop when it rains, but my hands are steadier than a surgeon's. I hold the hyperbaric wet welding certification, level 4. In this state, there are maybe 3 guys who have it. In this city, just me. Hey, John, I turned to see old Tom Miller walking toward me. Tom was the foreman, the man who looked like he'd been carved out of driftwood. He was wiping grease off his hands with a rag that was dirtier than his hands. Morning, Tom, I said, leaning on the railing. How's the intake looking? Intake is fine, Tom grunted, spitting on the concrete. But the mood isn't. You hear the rumors? I sighed. About the sale? It's been rumors for months, Tom. Old man Henderson wanted to retire to Florida. Can't blame him. It's not a rumor anymore, Tom said, his voice dropping low. The ink dried last night. Henderson is out. The new owners are some firm called Apex Capital. Private equity boys. The kind that strip the copper out of the walls before they sell the building. My stomach tightened. I'd seen it happen at the steel mills downriver. Suits come in, talk about synergy and efficiency, and 6 months later, the pension fund is gone, and the gates are padlocked. Who's running the show? I asked. Guy named Miles Watson, Tom said, grimacing like he'd tasted sour milk. He's doing a walkthrough at 10:00 hours. Wants all department heads on the floor. At 10:00 a.m. sharp, the doors to the main hangar rolled open. The contrast was immediate. On one side, you had us 50 men and women in stained coveralls, welding masks, and steel-toed boots. On the other side was Miles Watson. He looked like he'd stepped out of a magazine ad for cologne. He was young, maybe 32, wearing a tailored Navy suit that cost more than my truck. His shoes were polished leather, completely impractical for a floor covered in metal shavings and grease. He was flanked by a nervous-looking assistant carrying a tablet and a clipboard. Watson didn't walk. He strutted. He looked at the massive destroyer in the dry dock, not with awe, but with a sneer, like it was taking up too much space. He didn't introduce himself to the group. He didn't shake hands. He just walked to the center of the room, checked his expensive watch, and looked at his assistant. "Is this everyone?" Watson asked. His voice was nasally, the kind that carries in a boardroom but gets lost over the hum of a generator. "Yes, Mr. Watson," the assistant squeaked. Watson looked at us. He didn't see craftsmen. He didn't see 30 years of experience. He saw line items on a spreadsheet. He saw costs. "My name is Miles Watson," he announced, not bothering to raise his voice, forcing us to lean in. "I represent the new ownership. I've been looking at the books. Frankly, the bloat here is disgusting. We are bleeding money on overtime, redundant safety checks, and over-specialized labor. That ends today. We are pivoting to a lean operation." I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Tom. He gave me a look that said, "Keep your mouth shut, John." But I already knew. The storm wasn't coming. It was already here. The changes started the next morning, and they weren't subtle. It was like watching a butcher hack at a prime steak with a dull hatchet. The first thing to go was the coffee in the break room. It seems petty, but when you're working 12-hour shifts in freezing water or cramped bulkheads, that hot sludge is morale. Watson replaced it with a bending machine that charged $3 for a bottle of lukewarm water. Then came the layoffs. It started with the support staff. The janitors were fired, replaced by a cleaning service that came once a week. Within days, The bathrooms were a biohazard, and metal shavings were piling up in the walkways, a slipping hazard that Watson didn't seem to care about. Then he fired the safety inspectors. We don't need 3 guys walking around with clipboards telling us what we already know. Watson had told the department heads during a meeting I wasn't invited to. The foreman can handle safety checks. That put the load on Tom, who was already overworked. I found Tom 3 days later in his office, buried under a mountain of paperwork, looking like he hadn't slept in a week. He's cutting the inert gas supply orders by 30%, Tom told me, rubbing his temples. He says we're wasting argon. John, if we don't have proper shielding gas, the welds get porous. If the welds get porous on a subsurface hull, the ship sinks. I finished for him. Does he know that? I tried to tell him, Tom said, throwing a pen across the desk. He told me that I needed to adopt a growth mindset and stop making excuses for inefficiency. I clenched my fists. Where is he? Up in the glass tower, Tom said, pointing to the administrative offices that overlooked the floor. Renovating Henderson's old office. Apparently he needs an espresso machine and a view while he guts the place. The atmosphere on the floor shifted from pride to paranoia. The younger guys were terrified. They were rushing jobs, skipping the cooling cycles, doing sloppy work just to meet the new, impossible quotas Watson had set. I kept my head down and focused on the Vindicator. My job was specific. The propeller shaft seals and the lower hull integrity plates. These were critical systems. If they failed at depth, the pressure would crumple the steel like a soda can. I was in the middle of a complex TIG weld on a titanium alloy bracket when I felt a tap on my shoulder. I flipped my hood up. It was Watson. He was wearing a hard hat that looked brand new and ridiculous on top of his perfectly gelled hair. He was holding a stopwatch. You've been on this bracket for 45 minutes, Watson said, looking at the watch and then at me. It requires a multi-pass root weld and a slow cooling period to prevent cracking, I said, keeping my voice even. Titanium is temperamental. It's metal, Watson scoffed. It's not a brooding teenager. Heat it, stick it, move on. You're bottlenecking the assembly line. This isn't an assembly line, Mr. Watson, I said, standing up. I towered over him by good 4 inches. This is a naval destroyer. If this bracket fails, the drive shaft shears off. If that happens, sailors die. Watson's eyes narrowed. He didn't like being contradicted, especially not by a guy in dirty coveralls. I'll pay you to be a naval architect, Mr. Wood. I pay you to melt metal. Speed it up, or I'll find someone who can. He walked away, his shoes clicking on the concrete. Don't let him get to you, John. Sammy, my apprentice, whispered from the next bay. Sammy was 22, eager, and had a baby on the way. He needed this job. He's just blowing smoke. No, I said, watching Watson retreat to his glass tower. He's not blowing smoke. He's lighting a fuse. I went home that night to my wife, Scarlett. She was sitting at the kitchen table, looking over our retirement accounts. She saw the look on my face immediately. He's at it again, she asked, pouring me a cup of tea. He's dangerous, Scarlett, I said, sinking into the chair. He's going to get someone killed. He thinks he can run a shipyard like a fast food franchise. You have the contract protections, right? She asked. The Navy insisted on certified personnel. Yeah, I said, but Watson doesn't read contracts. He just looks at the bottom line. I didn't know it then, but Scarlett was right. The contract was my shield, but Watson was about to try and use it as a weapon. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. It was a Tuesday, pouring rain outside, drumming loudly against the metal roof of the hangar. I was gearing up for a wet dive. There was a suspected hairline fracture on the starboard rudder mount, and because the dry dock schedule was tight, we had partially flooded the dock to test the seals. I had to go in with full dive gear and a waterproof torch to inspect and tack it underwater. I was suiting up heavy canvas dive suit, helmet, oxygen umbilical, when the music stopped. Usually, the shop radio played classic rock over the PA system. It was the background noise of our lives, but suddenly it cut out, replaced by the screech of feedback. Attention all floor staff, Watson's voice boomed over the speakers. Stop work immediately and assemble at the main gantry. Now. I sighed, leaving my helmet on the bench but keeping the heavy suit on. I trudged over to the gathering point. The whole crew was there, welders, fitters, electricians. Everyone looked tired. Watson was standing on a crate, using it like a pulpit. He had a microphone in his hand. Beside him stood Brad, his HR lackey, looking pale. "I've been reviewing the payroll," Watson started, no preamble, "and I am appalled. The amount of money we are wasting on specialized labor is criminal." He made air quotes around the word specialized. "We have people here earning triple what the industry standard is," Watson continued, his eyes scanning the crowd. "For what? Creating sparks? Melting metal? A robot could do half your jobs. A monkey could do the other half." A murmur of anger went through the crowd. Old Tom stepped forward. "Mr. Watson, these men are craftsmen." "Quiet!" Watson snapped. "I'm speaking." He pulled a piece of paper from his pocket. "I am restructuring the pay scale. Effective immediately, all hourly wages are capped at $25 an hour. No exceptions. No specialized bonuses. No underwater hazard pay." The silence was deafening. $25, that was apprentice wages. For a master welder, it was an insult. For an underwater welder, it was insensate. "She can't do that," I said. My voice was deep, and it carried without a microphone. Watson's head snapped toward me. "Excuse me?" I stepped forward, the heavy rubber of my dive suit squeaking. "I said you can't do that. The Navy contract stipulates certified rates. Hazard pay is mandatory for underwater ops. It's federal regulation, not a suggestion." Watson laughed. It was a cold, dry sound. "Ah, Mr. Wood, the master diver. I was waiting for you to chime in." He jumped down from the crate and walked right up to me. He looked me up and down, sneering at the bulky suit, the tools on my belt, the grease on my hands. "You think you're special, don't you, John?" Watson said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "You think because you can hold your breath and use a flashlight you're worth 6 figures? I think I'm the only one who keeps this ship from sinking," I said calmly. "You're a laborer," Watson spat. "You're a grunt. A grease monkey." He turned to the crowd, gesturing at me. "Look at him. He thinks he's an engineer. He thinks he's indispensable." He turned back to me, his face inches from mine. "You are just a burner, John. That's all you are. You burn metal. You are a replaceable cog in my machine. And frankly, you are an expensive, rusty cog. I advise you to check the contract, Mr. Watson," I said, my blood boiling but my voice steady. "Specifically, the keyman clause regarding hyperbaric repairs." "I don't care about your clauses," Watson screamed, losing his composure. "I care about my profit margin. You want to quote regulations? Fine. Here's a regulation. You're fired." The crowd gasped. Sammy took a step forward, but I held up a hand. "Fired," I repeated. "Terminated. Gone. Get your junk and get off my property," Watson smirked. "I'll hire 3 guys to replace you for half the price by lunch." I looked at him. I looked at the Vindicator. I looked at the crew. "You're making a mistake, Miles," I said quietly. "The only mistake was not doing this day one," he replied. "Get out and leave the gear. That belongs to the company." I slowly unzipped the heavy dive suit. I stepped out of it, leaving it in a heap on the floor. I took off my tool belt and dropped it on top. I looked Watson in the eye. "Good luck," I said. I turned and walked toward the exit. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. I knew exactly what was going to happen. He thought he had just cut costs. What he had actually done was pull the plug on the only life support system his contract had. He called me just a burner. Well, he was about to find out what happens when you play with fire. The walk from the dry dock to the parking lot felt longer than usual. The rain had picked up, cold sheets of water turning the shipyard dust into a gray slurry. I could feel the eyes of the crew on my back as I left, a heavy silence hanging over the hangar that was louder than the machinery ever was. I reached my truck, a beat-up Ford F-150 that had seen better days but ran like a top, and unlocked the door. Before I could even climb in, the passenger door flew open. It was Sammy. He was soaked, his hair plastered to his forehead, his face pale. "Mr. Woodjohn, wait," he stammered, breathless. "You can't just leave." "I didn't leave, Sammy," I said, leaning against the steering wheel. "I was fired. There's a difference." But the rudder mount," Sammy said, panic rising in his voice. "Who's gonna weld the rudder mount?" "I'm only certified for flat plate. I can't do overhead, let alone underwater." "That's Watson's problem now," I said, though the knot in my stomach tightened. I hated leaving a job unfinished. It went against every fiber of my being. "He's crazy, John," Sammy said. He just told the agency to send over anyone who can hold a torch. He's gonna get someone killed. I looked at the kid. He was a good welder, had good hands, but he wasn't ready for this. Sammy, I said, looking him dead in the eye, listen to me closely. Do not touch that water. Do not go near the hyperbaric gear. If Watson orders you to dive, you refuse. You cite OSHA Regulation 1910, Subpart T. You tell him you aren't certified. He'll fire me, Sammy whispered. Better to be unemployed than dead, I said. Trust me, this ship is going down, and you don't want to be on it when it happens. Sammy nodded slowly, stepping back into the rain. I'll miss you, boss. Keep your head down, kid, I said. I started the engine and drove out of the gate. As I passed the security booth, I saw old Tom standing by the fence. He didn't wave. He just gave me a sharp salute, a grim expression on his face. He knew. I drove straight home. Scarlett was in the living room, surrounded by legal pads. She looked up as I walked in, dripping wet at 11:00 a.m. You're home early, she said, removing her reading glasses. Then she saw my face. What did he do? He fired me, I said, tossing my keys on the counter. Called me a burner, said I was too expensive. Scarlett didn't gasp. She didn't cry. She just set her pen down, her eyes narrowing into slits. He fired the only underwater certified welder in the middle of a Navy contract? Yep. Does he know about the keyman clause? I tried to tell him, I said, pouring myself a glass of water. He screamed over me, said he didn't care about my clauses. Scarlett stood up, walked over to the filing cabinet in the corner, and pulled out a thick folder. It was labeled Employment Contract. She opened it, flipped to page 34, and ran her finger down the text. Here it is, she read aloud. Section 8, Paragraph 4. The presence of a Level 4 hyperbaric certified welder is a mandatory condition of the Naval Refit Agreement. The specific individual, John Wood, is designated as key personnel. Removal of key personnel without prior written approval from the Naval Sea Systems Command constitutes an immediate breach of contract. She looked up at me, a dangerous smile forming on her lips. He didn't just fire you, John. He just voided his own insurance policy. So, what do we do? I asked. Sue him for wrongful termination? Oh, we could, Scarlett said, closing the folder. But that takes years. And honestly, I don't just want a settlement. I want him to learn a lesson. I was thinking the same thing, I said. I need to make a phone call. Who? Iron Holloway. Scarlett raised an eyebrow. You haven't spoken to the captain in 5 years. I know, I said, pulling my phone out. But he gave me a standing order. If I ever saw a threat to a vessel, I was to call him directly. And Watson is a threat. Watson isn't just a threat, I said, dialing the number. He's a torpedo in a suit. The phone rang 3 times before a voice answered. It wasn't a hello. It was a bark. Holloway. Captain, I said. It's John Wood. There was a pause. Then the tone shifted from gravel to granite. John, I assume you aren't calling to ask about my golf game. Considering I hate golf and you hate the phone. You assume right, sir. What's the situation? I just got fired. Fired? Holloway repeated. From the yard? Who the hell fires the best welder on the seaboard? New owner, Miles Watson, private equity kid. He thinks he can replace me with temp agency labor. On the Vindicator project? Holloway asked. His voice dropped an octave, becoming dangerously quiet. Yes, sir. We're mid-refit. The hull integrity plates are exposed. The starboard rudder mount is tacked, but not sealed. And he just kicked me off the property and said he's bringing in scabs. I heard a sound on the other end of the line. It sounded like a pencil snapping in half. Let me get this straight, Holloway said. A civilian with 0 maritime experience just removed the key personnel from a classified destroyer refit without notifying Invase AA? That's correct. He called me just a burner. Just a burner, Holloway mused. Interesting. I'm worried about the ship, Captain, I said genuinely. If he puts unqualified guys on that hull, if they use the wrong rod or don't preheat, we're looking at catastrophic failure at depth. You're a good man, John, Holloway said. Most men would just walk away and let it burn. But you called. I built that reputation, Captain. I don't want to see it sink because of some rich kid's ego. Sit tight, John, Holloway said. Do not, I repeat, do not go back to the yard. Do not offer advice. Do not answer their calls if they panic. You are a ghost. Understood. What are you going to do? Me, Holloway chuckled, a dry, terrifying sound. I'm currently in D.C. consulting for the Oversight Committee. I think it's time I scheduled a surprise audit. A very thorough audit. When? Give him a week, Holloway said. Let him hang himself. Let him bring in his scabs. Let him bring in the scabs. Let him ruin the schedule. When the rot sets in, I'll be there to sign the death certificate. Aye, aye, Captain. I hung up. Scarlett was watching me. Well? He said to give it a week, I said, a small smile creeping onto my face. And he said to become a ghost. I can do ghosts, Scarlett said, taking my phone from my hand and turning it off. Let's go fishing. The next 3 days were the strangest of my life. For 30 years, I had woken up at 5:00 a.m., drank coffee, and gone to the yard. Now, I woke up, drank coffee, and sat on the porch. We have a small cabin near the lake, about 40 minutes from the city. It's quiet, peaceful. The exact opposite of the shipyard. I spent my time fixing the deck, fishing for bass, and reading books I'd meant to get to for years. But my mind was always back at Dry Dock 4. I kept looking at the sky, wondering if it was raining at the yard, wondering if Sammy was okay. Scarlett was the gatekeeper. She monitored the emails in the landline. You have 5 missed calls from yard admin, she told me on the second day. Brad, I guessed, Watson's assistant, and 2 from a number I don't recognize, she added. Probably the agency trying to figure out how the hyperbaric rig works. I laughed. I took the regulator key with me. It's on my keychain. It's personal property. Petty, Scarlett grinned. I like it. By day 4, the call stopped. That worried me more than the ringing. Silence meant they thought they had solved the problem. Silence meant they had found someone else. I couldn't help myself. I drove into town to pick up some lumber, and I accidentally drove past the shipyard's main gate. It was chaos. There were trucks lined up outside, supply trucks that weren't being let in. I saw guys in generic orange vests, not the shipyard blues, wandering around the lot smoking cigarettes. The main crane, usually swinging constantly, was stationary. I parked across the street at the diner, pulled my hat down low, and ordered a coffee. I just watched. About 20 minutes later, a familiar truck pulled in. It was old Tom. He parked, got out, and stomped toward the gate. He was intercepted by a security guard I didn't recognize. One of Watson's new hires, probably. They argued. Tom pointed at the office. The guard shook his head. Tom threw his hard hat on the ground, kicked it, and stormed back to his truck. I pulled out my burner phone, the one I kept for emergencies, and texted Tom, "Me burger joint, 10 to mins." 10 minutes later, Tom slid into the booth opposite me. He looked 10 years older than he had last week. I thought you were a ghost, Tom grunted. I am. Just a hungry one, I said. What's happening in there, Tom? It's a disaster, John, Tom whispered, leaning in. A total disaster. He brought in this crew from Staff Right. They're not welders, they're day laborers who watched a YouTube video on soldering. They don't know the difference between MIG and TIG. They're using mild steel rods on the HY80 plates. I choked on my coffee. They're using mild steel on HY80? That's high-yield naval steel. The galvanic corrosion alone will eat through the hull in a month. I know, Tom hissed. I tried to stop them. Watson told me to stop obstructing progress. He fired 2 of the senior fitters for refusing to sign off on the work. And the underwater work? I asked, dreading the answer. He found a guy, Tom said, shaking his head. Some freelancer who claims he did rig work in the Gulf. Guy showed up with a recreational scuba tank and a wetsuit, no hot water suit, no comms hardline. He's gonna get the bends, I said, or electrocute himself. It's worse, Tom said. They couldn't get your rig working because you have the key, so they bypassed the safety regulator. They're running raw oxygen mixed with the argon. My blood ran cold. That's a bomb, Tom. If a spark hits a pocket of pure oxygen in a hyperbaric environment. Boom, Tom said. I'm terrified, John. I'm telling the guys to stay clear of the dock, but Watson is pushing for completion by Friday. Friday? I asked. That's impossible. He has a milestone payment due from the Navy, Tom explained. If the hull isn't certified by Friday, he misses the draw. He needs the cash flow. I nodded slowly. The picture was clear. Watson was desperate. He was cutting every corner to get paid, gambling with the lives of his crew and the safety of a U.S. Navy destroyer. "Get out of there, Tom," I said. "Call in sick. Take vacation. Just don't be there on Friday." "Why?" "Because," I said, checking my watch. "Friday is when the auditor arrives." Tom looked at me, confusion in his eyes. Then realization dawned. The captain, Iron Holloway. Tom let out a long, low whistle. "God help us." "God has nothing to do with it," I said, sliding a 20 on the table. "This is purely man-made, and it's about to come crashing down." Friday arrived with the kind of heavy, oppressive humidity that makes the air feel like a wet blanket. It was the perfect weather for a disaster. According to Tom, who had wisely called in with food poisoning, the shipyard was in a frenzy. Watson had the scab crew working double shifts, 16 hours straight trying to finish the hull plating before the Navy inspection deadline at 2:00 p.m. I was sitting in my living room, my phone on the table. Scarlett was pacing. "Do you think they'll actually finish?" she asked. "They'll finish something," I said. "Whether it floats is another question." At the yard, the scene was playing out exactly as I feared. I pieced it together later from Sammy and the security logs. The freelancer diver Watson hired was a guy named Rick. Rick was 24, arrogant, and had lied about his certifications. He was currently 80 feet down in the murky water of the flooded dry dock, trying to weld the rudder mount with a bypass torch and a recreational dive computer. Topside, the scene was just as bad. The staff-right crew was grinding down the welds on the outer hull to make them look pretty. That's the oldest trick in the book. Grinder and paint make me the welder I ain't. They were hiding porosity, undercut, and slag inclusions under a shiny layer of polished steel. To the untrained eye, it looked like a finished job. To an X-ray, it would look like Swiss cheese. Watson was pacing the gantry, shouting into his phone. "Yes, the milestone is met," he was barking. "The hull is sealed. We are ready for the sign-off. I want that wire transfer initiated by close of business." He hung up and turned to Brad. "Is the diver done?" "He's surfacing now, sir," Brad said, looking nervously at the bubbles breaking the water. Rick surfaced, spitting out his regulator. He looked exhausted and pale. "It's done," he gasped, climbing the ladder. "But the current down there, it's pulling weird." And the torch was sputtering. "Did you stick the metal?" Watson asked, not caring about the man's condition. "Yeah, I stuck it," Rick said. "Good. Get cleaned up. The inspector is here." A black government SUV pulled up to the main hangar doors. The plates read US GOVT. The doors opened, and two men stepped out. One was Commander Stone, the liaison I knew. He was young, by the book, and looked stressed. The other man was older. He wore a gray suit that looked like it was made of steel wool. He had a buzz cut that was white as snow and eyes that could drill through lead. He walked with a slight limp, a souvenir from the rig explosion where I saved him. It was Captain Iron Holloway. Watson practically skipped down the stairs to meet them, hand extended. "Commander Stone, welcome," Watson beamed. "And Captain Holloway," Stone introduced, his voice tight, independent auditor for a Navy Sea. He's here to conduct a spot verification." Watson's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, then returned, plastered on. "Wonderful. The more eyes, the better. You'll find everything is ahead of schedule and under budget." Holloway didn't shake Watson's hand. He just stared at him. "We'll see." The inspection began on the outer hull. Holloway walked slowly, tapping the steel plates with a small hammer. Ting! Ting! Thud! He stopped at a section the scab crew had just finished grinding. "Who welded this?" Holloway asked, his voice low. "Ah, that would be our team," Watson said quickly. "Top men. Very efficient." Holloway pulled a magnifying glass from his pocket. He leaned in close. Then he pulled out a file and scraped the surface of the weld. The shiny top layer peeled away, revealing a jagged, pitted mess underneath. "Slag inclusion," Holloway muttered. "And is this?" "Mild steel filler." He turned to Watson. "U7C11 rate rods on HY80 steel?" "Aye. I'm not sure of the technical specifics," Watson stammered. "I leave that to the floor managers." "You fired your floor manager," Holloway said. "Old Tom Miller isn't here, is he?" Watson blinked. "How did you know that?" Holloway ignored him. "Commander Stone, mark this section for X-ray. Actually, mark the entire starboard side." They moved to the dry dock. The water was dark, oily. The rudder mount, Holloway said. The most critical stress point on the vessel. Who did the underwater work? A specialist, Watson said. Highly recommended. Name? Rick Stevens. Holloway looked at his clipboard. I don't see a Rick Stevens on the approved vendor list. Is he level 4 hyperbaric certified? He's capable, Watson evaded. That's not what I asked, Holloway snapped. Is he certified? Before Watson could answer, a loud pop echoed from the water. It was followed by a hiss of escaping air. Bubbles began to froth violently on the surface. What is that? Stone asked, alarmed. That, Holloway said grimly, is a seal failure. The weld Rick had made the one done with the wrong voltage, and no preheat had cracked as it cooled. The water pressure was now forcing its way into the rudder housing. Get the pumps, someone yelled. It's too late for pumps, Holloway said calmly. The housing is compromised. You just flooded the steering gear room. Watson went pale. Flooded? That's expensive equipment. That's a $10 million mistake, Holloway corrected. And it just happened on your watch. Holloway turned to Watson, his face like thunder. Get your diver out of the building and get John Wood on the phone. Now. Wood? Watson scoffed, trying to regain some authority. I fired him. He's a dinosaur. I don't need him. You don't have a choice, Holloway said, because I'm shutting you down until a certified keyman inspects this mess. And guess who the only keyman is? My phone rang at 2:30 p.m. It was Watson. I let it go to voicemail. It rang again at 2:32 p.m. Voicemail. It rang again at 2:32 p.m. Voicemail. At 2:35 p.m., a text came through. Watson, Mr. Wood, we have a small situation. Need you to come in for a consult. Standard rates apply. I laughed out loud. Standard rates. The arrogance of this man was boundless. I typed back, sorry. Busy fishing. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. This time it was Commander Stone. I answered. Afternoon, Commander. John. Stone sounded desperate. Please tell me you're close. I'm at home, sir. About 40 minutes out. We need you, Stone said. The rudder mount failed. The steering gear room is taking on water. Holloway has shut down the site. Watson is melting down. I'm not an employee, Commander, I said calmly. I was terminated. I have no insurance, no liability coverage to enter that site. I heard a scuffle on the other end, and then Holloway's voice came on. John, cut the crap. How much? Hello, Captain, I smiled. Good to hear your voice. Name your price, John. I need that hull sealed before the salt water ruins the hydraulics. I want my contract reinstated, I said. Double the hourly rate, back pay for the week I was out, and a formal apology from Watson in writing. Done on the money, Holloway said. I'll work on the apology. Get your ass down here. I'll be there in 30. I hung up and looked at Scarlett. She was already holding my keys and my backup dive bag. Go get him, she said. I drove to the shipyard not with dread but with a sense of purpose. When I arrived, the gate was open. The security guard waved me through like I was the president. I pulled up to the hangar. Watson was standing there looking like he'd aged 10 years in an hour. His suit was rumpled, his hair messy. He saw me get out of the truck and stormed over. You did this, he accused, pointing a shaking finger at me. You sabotaged it. I didn't even slow down. I walked right past him. I didn't touch it, Miles. That's the problem. You got exactly what you paid for. I walked up to Holloway and Stone. Captain, I nodded. John. Holloway returned the nod. Suit up. We need a visual on the damage. I went to my locker, which thankfully hadn't been cleaned out yet, and grabbed my gear. My real gear. The heated suit, the comms unit, the custom torch. I walked to the edge of the dock. The water was churning. I checked my regulator, gave the thumbs up to the tender old Tom, who had miraculously recovered from his food poisoning and showed up the moment I texted him and jumped in. The water was cold, but familiar. I descended to the rudder mount. It was a butcher job. The weld looked like bird poop, lumpy, uneven, and cracked right down the center. The metal around it was scorched blue from too much heat. Talk to me, John. Holloway's voice crackled in my ear. It's bad, Captain, I said. Complete lack of fusion. Porosity everywhere. And he undercut the base metal. The plate is weakened. Can you fix it? I can patch it to stop the leak, I said. But the mount is ruined. It needs to be cut out and replaced. That's a 3-week job. Copy that. Seal it up. I spent the next 2 hours underwater, carefully grinding away the mess Rick had made and laying down a proper, certified bead. It was slow, grueling work, but when I finished, the leak stopped. I surfaced, broke the water, and climbed the ladder. I pulled off my helmet and took a deep breath of the oily air. Watson was waiting right there. "Is it fixed?" he demanded. "It's patched," I said, wiping water from my face, "but it's not fixed. The whole assembly is scrap." "Scrap?" Watson shrieked. "Do you know how much that costs?" "I do," I said, "about as much as you saved by firing me." Holloway stepped forward. "Mr. Watson, this facility is now under a stop work order, pending a full safety audit. You are in breach of contract on 4 counts. Safety violations, use of uncertified labor, failure to maintain key personnel, and gross negligence." Watson's jaw dropped. "Breach? You can't breach me. We have a deal. The Navy has a deal with a shipyard that follows the rules," Holloway said coldly. "Not with a gambling parlor. I'm recommending immediate cancellation of the Vindicator contract." Watson looked like he was going to vomit. "Cancellation? That's a $300 million contract. It will bankrupt us." Holloway shrugged. "Should have thought of that before you called your lead welder just a burner." The following morning, the shipyard felt more like a crime scene than a place of business. The USS Vindicator loomed in the dry dock, silent and accusing. Yellow "Do Not Cross" tape, stamped with the NAVCA logo, was draped across the access gangways. Captain Holloway didn't come alone this time. He brought a team 5 grim-faced auditors with clipboards, ultrasonic testing equipment, and no sense of humor. They swarmed the ship like ants on a picnic. I was there too, but not as an employee of Apex Capital. Holloway had formally retained me as an independent subject matter expert. My hourly rate was now triple what Watson had paid me, and the invoice went directly to the Navy, who would then deduct it from Watson's final settlement. The irony was delicious. Watson was locked in his glass office, pacing frantically. Through the window, I could see him screaming into his phone, likely trying to explain to his investors why their new acquisition was currently being dissected by the federal government. "Mr. Wood," Holloway called from the deck, "I need you to look at the pipe fitting in the engine room." I climbed the scaffolding. The engine room was a labyrinth of pipes, valves, and turbines. Holloway pointed to a high-pressure steam line. "Tell me what you see," he said. I inspected the weld. It was clean, smooth, perfect. "This is one of mine," I said. "Did it 6 months ago?" "I look at the flange next to it," Holloway said. I looked. It was fresh work, shiny and new, but the bolts were the wrong grade. They were grade 5 commercial bolts, not the grade 8 mil-spec required for high-pressure steam. If that line pressurized, I said, shaking my head, those bolts would shear. Steam explosion. Anyone in this room would be boiled alive. "Who signed off on this?" Holloway asked, scribbling on his clipboard. I looked at the tag attached to the flange. It was initialed M.W. Tom. "Miles Watson?" I asked, incredulous. "He's signing off on QA checks." Apparently, Holloway said dryly, "He fired the QA manager last week, remember? Decided to streamline the approval process. He doesn't even know what a shear strength rating is," I muttered. "He's about to learn," Holloway said. "We're done here. Let's go check the hull plating." The audit took 3 days. It was a bloodbath. They found uncalibrated torque wrenches, expired fire extinguishers, unauthorized chemical solvents, and worst of all, fraudulent timesheets where Watson had billed the Navy for senior technicians, while paying minimum wage to undocumented day laborers. Every violation was documented, photographed, and cataloged. The file on Holloway's desk grew thicker by the hour. It wasn't just incompetence anymore, it was fraud. On the 4th day of the audit, the final nail in the coffin arrived. We were in the main conference room. Holloway sat at the head of the table, flanked by Commander Stone and 2 Navy lawyers. Watson sat on the other side, sweating profusely, accompanied by a very expensive-looking attorney he had flown in from New York. "This is a witch hunt," Watson's lawyer began, smoothing his tie. "These minor infractions are being blown out of proportion to justify a contract renegotiation. My client is willing to pay a small fine, but minor infractions?" Holloway interrupted. He slid a photo across the table. It was the X-ray of the starboard hull. The image showed the steel plates, but inside the metal, there were dark, spiderweb-like lines. "Stress fractures?" Holloway said. caused by improper thermal cycling. Your crew heated the HY-80 steel too fast and cooled it too fast. The molecular structure is compromised. The armor plating is now brittle. Watson looked at the photo, then at his lawyer. So? We can fix it. You can't fix it, I spoke up in the back of the room. You can't re-temper armor plate once it's installed. You have to cut it out and start over. And how much is that, Watson asked, his voice trembling. To replace 40% of the whole plating? I did the mental math. About $80 million, plus 6 months of dry dock time. The room went silent. But that's not the critical failure, Holloway said, leaning forward. The critical failure is the paperwork. He pulled out a document. It was the certification log for the Vindicator. You signed this document on Tuesday, Holloway said to Watson, certifying that all underwater welding was performed by a Level 4 specialist in accordance with NAVSEA standards. I assumed it was, Watson stammered. You assumed, Holloway said, or you lied. Because on Tuesday, your Level 4 specialist, Mr. Wood here, was sitting on his porch fishing. You knowingly submitted a false claim to the Department of Defense. Watson's lawyer went pale. He whispered something urgently in Watson's ear. Watson's eyes widened. That's a felony, Mr. Watson, Commander Stone added quietly. 5 years in federal prison, per count. Watson slumped in his chair. The arrogance was gone. The swagger was gone. All that was left was a scared little boy in a suit that was suddenly too big for him. I was just trying to improve margins, Watson whispered. You didn't improve margins, Holloway said, closing the folder. You compromised national security. The hammer dropped 2 hours later. Captain Holloway stood on the steps of the administration building. The entire shipyard crew, those who were left, plus the scabs who were hanging around, gathered to hear the verdict. Effective immediately, Holloway announced, his voice booming. The Department of the Navy is terminating the contract with Apex Capital for the refit of the USS Vindicator. This termination is for cause. A gasp went through the crowd. Furthermore, Holloway continued, Apex Capital is hereby debarred from bidding on any future government contracts. The shipyard is ordered to cease all operations until the vessel can be safely towed to a competent facility. Watson stood in the doorway watching his empire crumble. He looked shell-shocked, but Holloway wasn't done. The Navy will also be seeking damages, he added, to cover the cost of the repairs, the delay, and the transport. The estimated claim is $312 million. Watson's knees actually buckled. He had to grab the doorframe to stay upright. He had bought the shipyard for $50 million, leveraging every asset he had. A $300 million liability wouldn't just bankrupt the company, it would bury it. I stood next to old Tom. He lit a cigarette, took a long drag, and exhaled. Well, Tom said, that's that. We're all out of a job. Maybe not, I said, watching Watson. The dry dock is still here. Yeah, but the owner is dead in the water, Tom said. Exactly, I smiled, which means there's going to be a fire sale. I walked over to Watson. He didn't even look at me. He was staring at the ground, mumbling to himself. Miles, I said. He looked up. His eyes were red. What? You want to gloat? Go ahead, rub it in. I don't want to gloat, I said. I want to make you an offer. An offer? He laughed bitterly. I owe the Navy $300 million. What can you offer me? I can offer you a way out, I said. You declare bankruptcy. The assets you declare bankruptcy. The assets go to auction. But if you drag this out, the Navy will come after your personal assets. Your house, your car, your offshore accounts. Holloway is in a mood. Watson flinched. Or, I continued, you cooperate. You liquidate quickly. You let the assets go to pay off the debts. You walk away with nothing, but you walk away free. Why do you care? He asked. I don't care about you, I said. I care about this yard. I care about this yard. I care about these men. And I care about that ship. Watson looked at the Vindicator, then at me. You planned this. No, I said. You planned this. I just read the blueprint. I walked away, leaving him standing in the ruin of his own making. The burner, and just burned the house down. But unlike Watson, I knew how to rebuild from the ashes. The collapse of Apex Capital was swift and brutal. Within 48 hours of Holloway's announcement, the creditors descended like vultures. The shipyard gates were padlocked. Notices of seizure were plastered on the windows, and the USS Vindicator sat in the dry dock like a hostage. I spent those days finalizing my reports for the Navy. Since I was technically an independent consultant for the government, I was one of the few people allowed on site. I found Watson in the main office on a Tuesday evening. The power had been cut to the admin building to save money, so he was packing his personal effects by the light of his smartphone flashlight. He didn't look like a CEO anymore. He looked like a refugee. His tie was gone, his top button undone, and he hadn't shaved in 3 days. "Come to steal the copper wiring?" Watson asked, his voice hollow, not looking up from the box he was filling with desk ornaments. "I'm just finishing my rounds, Miles," I said, leaning against the door frame. He stopped packing and slumped into his expensive ergonomic chair. "They froze my accounts, John. Everything. Personal, business, offshore. The SEC is investigating me for defrauding a government entity. My dad, he won't even take my calls." It was almost pitiful. Almost. But then I remembered the way he had looked at Sammy, the way he had endangered the crew, the way he had called me a burner. "You gambled, Miles," I said. "You bet on the wrong horse." "I just wanted to make it profitable," he whispered, looking at his hands. "I looked at the spreadsheets. The labor costs were astronomical. I thought you guys were just padding the hours." "That's the problem," I said, walking into the room. "You looked at the cost, but you never understood the value. You see a welder making $60 an hour, and you think robbery. You don't see the 20 years it took to learn how to weld upside down in pitch-black water without dying. You don't see the lives that depend on that weld holding." Watson looked up at me, tears brimming in his eyes. "I'm going to prison, aren't I?" "Maybe," I said honestly. "Holloway is pushing for it. Fraud is a serious charge." Suddenly, Watson stood up and rushed toward me. For a second, I thought he was going to attack me, but he stopped a foot away, his hands shaking. "John, please," he begged, his voice cracking. "You have Holloway's ear. You're the key man. If you talk to him, tell him it was a mistake. Tell him I was just incompetent, not malicious. If they drop the fraud charges, I can avoid jail. I'll lose the money, fine, but I can't go to prison." He reached out and grabbed my sleeve. "I'm begging you. I have a family. I have a kid on the way." I looked at his hand on my arm, then at his face. I saw the fear. It was the same fear Sammy had when Watson threatened to fire him. "You have a kid?" I asked. "Yes. Due in October." I pulled my arm away gently. "Then you better start saving your pennies, Miles, because babies are expensive." "Will you talk to him?" "I'll tell him the truth," I said. "That you were a man who didn't know the difference between a bolt and a screw, and you were too arrogant to ask. Incompetence might save you from prison, but it won't save your reputation." Watson nodded, defeated. "Thank you. That's more than I deserve." "Yeah," I said, turning to leave. "It is." As I walked out into the cool night air, I felt a weight lift. He wasn't a monster. He was just a fool. And fools didn't belong in charge of shipyards. 2 months later, the shipyard went up for auction. It was a cold, crisp morning. The auction was held in the main hangar, the very place where Watson had fired me. The crowd was a mix of scrap metal dealers, real estate developers looking to bulldoze the place for condos, and a few maritime competitors looking to pick over the bones. I stood in the back, wearing a clean button-down shirt and my good boots. Scarlett was next to me, holding a folder thick with documents. Old Tom was there too, looking nervous. "You sure about this, John?" Tom whispered. "It's a lot of money." "It's a steal, Tom," I replied softly. The auctioneer, a fast-talking man with a nasally drone, started the bidding. "Lot 1, the contents of the administrative offices. Desks, computers, chairs. Do I hear 5,000? The office gear went to a liquidator. The forklifts went to a construction company. Then came the big one. Lot 45. The auctioneer bellowed. "The leasehold of the shipyard facility, including Dry Dock 4, the gantry cranes, and the standing infrastructure. Note, this lot comes with assumed environmental liabilities and the obligation to clear the current vessel, the USS Vindicator, subject to Navy approval." The room went quiet. The liabilities were the poison pill. No real estate developer wanted to deal with a half-repaired destroyer and potential EPA fines for the oil spill Watson had caused. The scrap dealers didn't want the hassle of Navy bureaucracy. "Opening bid at $1 million, the auctioneer said. Silence. 500,000? Scrabber raised his paddle. 500. I have 500. Do I hear 6? I nudged Scarlett. She handed me the paddle. I raised it. 600,000, I said clearly. Heads turned. People whispered. Who is that? Isn't that the welder? The scrapper looked at me, then at the massive ship looming behind us. He knew the cost of cutting up a Navy ship was astronomical without a contract. He lowered his paddle. I have 600,000 going once, the auctioneer called out. Going twice. 700, a voice called from the front. It was a developer, a guy in a suit. He was eyeing the waterfront view. 800, I said immediately. 900, the developer countered. I looked at Scarlett. We had crunched the numbers. We had our savings, my retirement fund, and a substantial loan secured against my consulting fees. But we had a limit. 1 million, I said. This was it, our ceiling. The developer hesitated. He pulled out his phone, probably calculating demolition costs. He looked at the grease-stained floor, the rusting beams, the smell of industry. He shook his head and put his paddle down. Too much work. 1 million going once, the auctioneer shouted. The sound bounced off the steel walls. Going twice. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a jackhammer. Sold to bidder number 42. The gavel slammed down, a crack of thunder that signaled a new beginning. Old Tom let out a whoop that echoed through the hangar. Scarlett squeezed my hand so hard I thought she'd break a knuckle. I walked up to the podium to sign the papers. The auctioneer looked at my check. Congratulations, he said. You just bought yourself a whole lot of headaches. No, I said, signing my name on the line that said, Owner. I just bought myself a job. As I turned around, I saw Captain Halloway standing at the edge of the crowd. He wasn't smiling, he never smiled, but he gave me a slow, respectful nod. He knew. The contract wasn't gone. The Navy needed that ship fixed. And now, the key man owned the facility. The moment the ink was dry, Halloway would be walking into my office to renegotiate. And this time, the terms would be very different. 3 weeks later, the sign above the main gate was changed. Wooden-ass associates, Marine Repersurdy Naval Contractors. The associates part was important. I gave old Tom and the senior crew a small equity stake. We weren't just employees anymore. We were partners. The first thing I did was rehire everyone Watson had fired. The janitors, the safety inspectors, the master welders. The break room got its coffee machine back high-end, industrial-strength caffeine. I sat in what used to be Watson's office. I have removed the espresso machine and the abstract art. Now, the walls were covered in schematics and tide charts. The phone rang. It was Halloway. Mr. Wood, he said. Or should I say, Mr. CEO? John is fine, Captain, I said, looking out the window at the bustling floor below. Sparks were flying, cranes were moving, and the Vindicator was finally getting the care she deserved. The new contract is ready for signature, Halloway said. We've approved the budget increase for the remediation of the previous errors. Glad to hear it. We're on schedule for the hull seal by Tuesday. Good. Don't make me come down there, John. You're always welcome, Captain. Coffee is on the house. I hung up and walked out onto the balcony. The air smelled of ozone and brine. It smelled like work. It smelled like victory. Sammy waved at me from the deck of the destroyer. He was wearing a fresh welding hood properly secured. I waved back. I wasn't just a burner. I was the fire that forged the steel. And I was the one who was going to keep this place standing for the next generation. You know, people often mistake silence for weakness. They think because you work with your hands, because you get dirty, that you aren't smart. They think because you don't wear a three-piece suit, you don't understand how the world works. Miles Watson made that mistake. He looked at a spreadsheet and saw numbers. I looked at a ship and saw lives. I made mistakes too. I stayed quiet for too long. I let the resentment build up until it almost exploded. But I learned something crucial through all of this turmoil. Know your contract. Whether you are a welder, a coder, or a teacher, know what you were signed up for. Read the fine print. My key man clause was my shield. Without it, I would have just been another guy in the unemployment line. Knowledge is the only weapon they can't take away from you. Document everything. When things started going south, I didn't just complain. I kept logs. I knew the regulations better than the boss did. When you are right and you have the paper to prove it, you are invincible. Never compromise safety for speed. It doesn't matter if the boss is screaming. It doesn't matter if the deadline is tight. If you cut corners, people get hurt. Your integrity is worth more than their bonus. Trust your skills. They can fire you. They can mock you. They can try to replace you with cheaper labor. But true competence, that is rare. And in the end, the world always comes crawling back to the people who actually know how to keep the lights on and the ships floating. Don't let anyone tell you you're just anything. You're the master of your craft. Own it.